And what I'm going to be talking about today is my postdoctoral work done under the supervision of Patty Solomon at McMaster on developing an HIV disability questionnaire. And this work was derived here in Canada with the HDQ Toronto team listed there. And I've also had the opportunity to work with a brilliant community advisory committee going back to my graduate study days. And most recently, as of last year, via a connection, a colleague of Stephanie and Nancy and I's, Emma Stokes at Trinity College Dublin, was a visiting professor at the University of Toronto. And she let us know about this Dobbin Scholarship through the Ireland Canada Foundation. And I applied for this scholarship and was fortunate enough to be successful. I think it had to do with the name only. But through Emma's connections, introduced me to Colin Bergen and Siobhan O'Dea, who are here from Dublin today. And so this work has really grown of being able to not only look at the validation of a tool in a Canadian or Toronto or Southern Ontario context, but also look at it in another environment over in Ireland as well. So we're at the beginning stages of looking at some of these data, and we're looking forward to sharing this with you. So again, this is now becoming a collaboration between Canada and Ireland. Here are the academic players here, but also many community organizations, and we have the Canadian ones, of course, including Quigger, Casey House, Ministry of Health, AIDS Committee of Toronto, many of these organizations in which we're generous in terms of with recruitment and will be involved with knowledge translation, and a community organization that I was introduced to in Dublin, Open Heart House as well. So the purpose of this research was to develop and assess the measurement properties of a new HIV-specific questionnaire called the HIV Disability Questionnaire, or HDQ for short, to describe disability experienced by adults living with HIV, not only now in Canada, but how well this actually applies to the Ireland context as well. Now, where this questionnaire came from was the earlier episodic disability framework that was derived from the perspectives of 38 men and women living with HIV in Toronto, who described living with 4 possible dimensions of disability, ranging from the symptoms and impairments, including pain, fatigue, weakness, the more functional pieces around day-to-day activities, which we heard from Brenda's presentation yesterday, challenges to social inclusion, as well as this concept of uncertainty and worrying about the future. This framework really served as the development of the content for the questionnaire. So the items that were generated in the HDQ came from the detailed categories from this framework. And working with the Community Advisory Committee over a number of meetings, talking about order, wording, item responses, we established a draft HDQ. And the purpose of this tool is to describe the presence, severity, and the episodic nature of disability experienced by adults living with HIV. This draft HDQ includes 69 items that span those domains, and also has one item at the very end of the questionnaire that asks individuals, would you consider yourself, today as you're filling out this questionnaire, is this a good day for you or is this a bad day? To try to get a sense of where someone might land on some of that fluctuating aspect of a possible framework. The questionnaire is a self-reported questionnaire, asks how an individual is feeling on that given day, and then for each of those health challenges, we ask a question whether that challenge has fluctuated and within the past week, and that could mean it improved, it worsened, or maybe did a little bit of both. We had the opportunity to take this draft HDQ out and assess its sensibility, so face validity, content validity, ease of usage, some of the pieces that Richard was talking about. We administered the HDQ to 22 adults living with HIV and also had it reviewed by 5 clinicians who work in HIV care. The results from this assessment, we administered but also did follow-up interviews. The participants provided some really good considerations for item wording, content, terminology, and really helped sort of refine the questionnaire to its next stage. We then sort of said, well, we think this thing has 4 domains because the episodic disability has 4 domains of disability, but does it really? So we then actually took a statistical approach called a factor analysis, which is a technique used that can help to determine what the underlying domain structure of a questionnaire might be. And it uses the responses from various items from participants in order to see which items are hanging together and which items may establish a domain for that questionnaire. So we recruited just over 360 adults living with HIV here in Southern Ontario. We administered the HDQ followed by a demographic questionnaire. And this is what we found, that symptoms and impairments domain actually trickled out into 3 different domains. And not surprisingly, one was specific to physical symptoms, the other cognitive, and the other one mental emotional. And then the other 3 dimensions or domains stood. And this kind of gives you a snapshot of the number of items that are comprised each of those domains. So this is an example questionnaire here, a statement such as, I feel too tired to do my usual activity, so getting at fatigue. And individuals rate from not at all to extremely, and then we have that episodic question as to whether that challenge fluctuated in the past week. We then moved on to phase 3, measurement, development, property, validation, years and years of work. So what did we do? We wanted to know how well do the questions in each domain really hang together? And that's where this thing called internal consistency reliability is. Secondly, how well does the HDQ measure what it's supposed to measure? Is it really measuring disability? And that's called construct validity. And then lastly, we wanted to know how consistent is the HDQ at measuring disability over time? Test-retest reliability. So we recruited adults living with HIV here in Toronto a couple of years ago, between May and June 2011. And then I said I had the opportunity working with I was there for 4 weeks, and we were able to recruit just over 100 participants for this study, which is really a testament of the dedication and the amazing guide clinic. Most of the participants in Toronto were recruited from AIDS service organizations, and most of the participants in Dublin were recruited from the Guide Clinic at St. James's Hospital, with a smaller proportion from Open Heart House. In Toronto, it took individuals a median of 10 minutes to complete the HDQ. In Dublin, 13.
Did you have to show that?
I actually think there's a large amount of measurement error here, and that was my fault because I was the one timing the HDQ administration in Dublin, whereas in Toronto it was NChem, who I think was much, much more reliable. It was the Guinness, yes. We also administered 7 health status questionnaires, and this was to get at that aspect of construct validity. And I'll share some of the data because we've been looking at some of the similarities and where some of the differences between the samples lie. So some of the characteristics. Proportionately, there were more men living with HIV who participated in the study, and most taking antiretrovirals. But we found with respect to the sample that Canadians tended to be older, were living with more self-reported comorbidities, living with a longer time since diagnosis, and not as many Canadians in this particular sample were currently working for pay. The Toronto participants also tended to rate their health status as being fair or good, versus the Dublin participants rated their health status as being very good or excellent. You can see some of the common concurrent conditions that were reported by each of the participants here. So in Toronto, muscle pain, mental health, and joint pain are up there. Joint pain, hepatitis C, and muscle pain up there for the Dublin participants. And the number who lived alone, actually there were more participants in Canada who tended to live alone compared with those in Dublin. So we then move on to the actual analysis of the HDQ, and it's actually has 3 separate scores. There is a presence score that's calculated by summing the number of health challenges, a disability severity score by summing the severity item scores, and then an episodic score where we tally up the number of challenges that participants indicated fluctuated in the week. We transformed each of those scores out of 100. Higher scores indicated greater presence, severity, and episodic nature of disability. And this is the resultant HDQ scores. So if you look at actually the Toronto sample, the Toronto sample across the board tended to have higher presence and severity scores across all of the domains, except for uncertainty. Uncertainty was the one domain where presence and severity scores were similar across the Dublin and Toronto participants. Also similarly were the median episodic scores, of which both the Toronto and Dublin participants rated physical symptoms and impairments being the ones that fluctuated most. And that's not surprising. Things like pain, fatigue, or weakness may fluctuate more often than obviously a person's ability to return to the workforce, for example, in social inclusion. When we asked what types of disability were episodic, for Toronto, and Dublin, fatigue was right up there, as well as feeling sad, down, and depressed. And aches and pains also was similarly up. On the other 7 health status measures that we looked at, the Dublin participants tended to rate, as mentioned earlier, those lower, along with the lower HDQ scores, had lower scores on the the SES-D summary score, so of anxiety and depression, higher scores on the SF-36 quality of life questionnaire around physical and mental health, less symptoms and impairments as measured by the HIV symptom index, and greater social support. Where there was no difference on these scores was when it came to the HIV stigma scale. So it seemed like the Toronto and Dublin participants were had similar score ratings around stigma. Now getting on to the nitty-gritty of the measurement properties, and I'll summarize these very quickly. The idea being that internal consistency reliability is measured by something called a Cronbach's alpha. It ranges from 0 to 1, and anything above a 0.8 is considered acceptable. And you can see here that for Cronbach's alpha in both the Toronto and Dublin samples, when we're looking across the domains, they ranged anywhere from 0.837 in the cognitive scale up to 0.93 in mental emotional. So demonstrating internal consistency reliability. So these items are hanging together like we thought they would. We also, looking at the episodic ones instead of Cronbach's alpha, when you've got a yes-no, you look at something called a Cooter-Richardson, but it's scored, interpreted in the same way. And here the results ranged anywhere from 0.808 in the cognitive domain to 0.954 in uncertainty, demonstrating also that the items are hanging together in those episodic domains as well. Now, when we asked ourselves, is this HDQ measuring what we think it's measuring? The way we did that is looking at something called construct validity. Disability is not a tangible construct. There's no gold standard to measure it. So the way that you establish construct validity is you test hypotheses. So we, for example, thought that the activity of daily living scale in the World Health Organization disability schedule would be highly correlated with the difficulties with day-to-day activities domain in the HDQ. And the number of hypotheses, we set those a priori. I promise we didn't cheat. And there were 40 hypotheses that we tested. In Toronto, 32 out of those 40 were confirmed. In Dublin, 22 were. We also had 2 hypotheses, and we hypothesized that participants who were older with more comorbidity would have higher scores on the HDQ, and that was the Toronto sample compared with the Dublin Dublin sample, and both of those hypotheses were also confirmed. So this demonstrates that the HDQ did demonstrate construct validity across both samples. Now, does the HDQ consistently measure disability? This is the test-retest reliability. And we actually only collected time 1 and time 2 data here in Toronto. If I had longer time in Dublin, and I wish I did, because maybe the sun would have shined, we could have done the time 1, time 2. But looking sort of here through the Toronto lens, anything, this is scored by an interclass correlation coefficient. Anything greater than 0.7 is defined as acceptable. And here the scores range from 0.8 in the cognitive domain up to 0.89 in the challenges to social inclusion domain, demonstrated that the HDQ consistently was measuring disability over time. So in summary, when looking at just purely those HDQ descriptive scores, uncertainty was the highest in terms of severity and presence among both Canadian and Irish participants. And given that some earlier work, when we looked at some of the existing HIV-specific measures out there, uncertainty seemed to be a dimension that was not being captured in some of the other disability measures out there. The physical symptoms and impairments seem to be the dimension that fluctuated most on a daily basis, and the HDQ severity and presence scores were higher among Canadian participants compared with the Irish participants, except for that domain of uncertainty. Looking at the measurement properties in summary, the HDQ items hung together, so demonstrated that internal consistency, reliability. They demonstrated elements of construct validity as well as test-retest reliability, being to consistently measure disability over time. So some of the considerations for interpretation, the sample here were primarily considered, quote, healthy adults living with HIV. So we were seeing that there were some ceiling effects of certain items, particularly around the difficulties with day-to-day activities, because people were managing their basic activities of daily living quite well. Keeping in mind the recruitment strategies, here in Toronto we recruited primarily from AIDS service organizations, where in Dublin it was primarily through the Guide Clinic at St. James's Hospital. And so we've been actually having quite a few Skype calls and discussions around where the differences in the construct validity lied, with more hypotheses being confirmed here in Toronto versus in Ireland. And we think there could be obviously some differences here with respect to HDQ scores, having to do obviously with Irish being a younger cohort with less reported comorbidity. There may be cultural differences there and differences along with HDQ interpretation. And just also to keep in mind that this HDQ did not really, or is not able to really distinguish between the source of those health-related challenges, whether they be HIV-related or other health condition-related. So I've told you what we know, but there's still a lot that we don't know. For example, what do the HD scores really mean? So what's their interpretability? And lastly, does the HDQ, is it able to measure change in disability when change actually occurs? And this is called responsiveness. So these are really kind of the next steps ahead. And we've been able to start some discussions around setting up a pilot community-based exercise intervention in order to sort of look at some of these pieces. So I'm really excited to have heard, Darren's presentation this week, as well as Becca's work, and really hoping to tap in on all of the work that you've done and the success that you've had implementing it within a hospital context as to how we might modify that to the community context. So lastly, just tons of acknowledgements here. I think obviously funding through the CIHR for this work, a Michael DeGroot postdoctoral fellowship that I had at McMaster, and the Ireland Canada University Foundation through the Dobbin Scholarship. Huge thanks to Patty, Colum, and Siobhan, who are here and collaborating with this work. Ahmed Bayumi, who's on service and hasn't been able to make it much here, and all of the other collaborators who have been involved along the way. Thank you.